Well, hello. This is the 11th session of the English module. In this session, I'd like to discuss what was presented last week in the activities and how that relates to the final exam you'll have to take for this module. And, and in order to do so, make sure that you have looked at the activity for last week 10 activity on Moodle, and that you've done the exercises and looked up the answers in the answer key. So these are the main 3 points we'll see today. What was the relevance of working on the poster rather than a full-blown study? And how does that relate to the final exam? Note that so far the indication we've had about the final exam is that it should take place on the first week of June, but dates have to be confirmed. That's what the acronym stands for here, TBC, to be confirmed. The poster's title for last week was entitled Positive Psychology versus CBT for Clinical Depression. I've highlighted versus here because occasionally you may hesitate on how to pronounce it. So what I'll do in the rest of the session is I'll indicate linguistic aspects via these orange squares. If you want, you can find the full original poster online where I found it by clicking the URL. And as you can see below with the reference, this was part of the publication material of a conference that took place in 2014. So this is a very common and frequent strategy to communicate main research information to colleagues at conferences. So generally, before researchers walk into a conference room and listen to a brand new study, what they want to know is have an idea about where they started from and what their main findings have been. The poster provides such information very quickly in a form that you will have noticed is very close to that of the abstract. So we've discussed that before. The abstract is the codified summary which appears just below the title of a full article and which contains the key IMHAD sections regarding the study. Now, note how in the title here it says results from a 6-month follow-up study, which really stands for results from a follow-up study which lasted 6 months. Note how the English language is so much more efficient in creating, I'm comparing to French, in creating an adjective group with the hyphen version here of the noun group, 6-month, that qualifies follow-up study. Note how the S has disappeared from the word month because it has been turned into an adjective. In reality, this noun group here contains two qualifiers. Study is the noun, which is qualified by one follow-up, and two, the length of that follow-up, a 6-month follow-up. We'll find other instances of this, and I encourage you to make notes of these aspects because they can help you clarify the meaning of some information in scientific reports more quickly. Now, the layout of the poster drew particular attention to the introduction. Now, I've highlighted here the key stages, the founding stones of the scientific report, which are laid there in the introduction. Note how the beginning of the introduction, as we've seen before, is always going to indicate the main topic, and very slowly but surely what happens is that every element falls into place, and we start with a rather broad topic which is then refined down to what research has provided, what research has shown so far, and what therefore would be interesting to study, so that we can then reach at the end of the funnel, we can then reach the hypothesis. And I've highlighted the key structure here so that you bear that in mind the day of your tests in the May or June exam. You'll notice that the same structure will apply to your scientific report. The main topics presented here, and then the literature review is what research has shown so far, is always referenced as in between parentheses, such as you've got 3 examples here: Calenda, etc., et al., Sin et al., and Seligman et al. These references between parentheses are not pieces of information that we will directly ask you questions about. However, knowing about what this bit in the text does, what kind of information it contains, can help you read more strategically and more quickly. The next thing is that typically in an introduction, the objective of the study, or here aim of the study, the third part, would be more clearly related to the body of the introduction. This being a poster, it has been designed as sort of more of a graphic piece, and therefore they've played up with the different parts. But you would find this in the introduction section as one main part. And what's missing in the poster, which was the topic of one of your questions, is the hypothesis. Assuming that's just one. If there were several hypotheses, we'd pronounce it differently. Note that hypotheses are expectations, predictions, assumptions. So these are all the synonyms that you've come across before. And before we move on to the next part, let me draw your attention to the linking words which I used here. Note how it begins with "despite a variety of empirically supported treatments." Here, what they're doing is drawing our attention straight to the relevance of their topic. So they're not just sort of explaining in a broad manner how that topic happens to be. They go straight to this information that much has been done on this topic. However, there's room for more investigation of this aspect. Therefore, so you do look up, if you're not sure what despite means, malgré, and therefore, par conséquent, do look up these linking words. They are key to your final exam. You must have quite a lot of vocabulary related to the articulation of ideas in order to get by. In the next paragraph, we have "over the past decade." Again, an indication that they're referring to past research, or in other words, they are proceeding on with the literature review. And finally, we get to "however." So cependant. However indicates the niche aspect of their research, and that gap they identified and they believe should be investigated. What would logically follow are hypotheses, but we'll comment on how we can infer what these hypotheses were from the information provided in the rest of the poster. We'll come back to that after we've looked at the overall structure. Now, for the method section, we've typically told you that a method section would follow the stages of presenting the study design, maybe provide the overview first, study design, then indicate how the sample was constituted, who the participants were, what instruments were used, if material was used, what was it, and the procedure. Now, here in this poster, information has been synthesized to highlight the most salient points. But what information we do note is typically information about the study design, which is implicitly stated by that section called treatments. In the treatment section, we find participants were assigned to one of 2 manualized protocols. One, a PPI program, including well-validated hedonic and eudaimonic interventions, or 2, a standard CBT program. Now, both treatments had a 10-session group format. This either or structure with one PPI program on the one hand and the CBT program on the other hand is key to understanding the study design. So when you gather some experience, you can detect the fact that what they're referring to here is a clinical trial. In order to, as you will, I'm sure you have looked up, this was part of the exercises from last week. So what PPI refer to, PPI refers to, what CBT is, but also what we mean by saying a clinical trial. So do look up the information there. Now, this allocation to either one group or the other is key to a clinical trial. What it doesn't say here regarding the sample, again, because it's the poster and you can't expect it to have all of this information, is how the participants were allocated to each group. As you know, a clinical trial to have scientific validity needs to apply a random allocation of participants. So participants were actually randomly allocated to either program number 1 or program number 2. While we're at it, note that it says here both treatments had a 10-session group format. This is again the adjective form that we were commenting on before in the title, a 6-month study or a 6-month follow-up study. What it says here is a group format which lasted 10 sessions, and you can see how that's so much more efficient. We have another similar structure in the measures with an 11-item index. And if you look at 21 items there, can you guess what its adjective form would be? So if I wanted to qualify inventory, would I say 20 items inventory? Unlikely. The S would be dropped and it would be turned into a hyphenated version. So 21 item inventory. The S disappears and the hyphen appears. A 21 item inventory, for example. So that closing the linguistic parenthesis here, let's go back to the instruments and how they are relevant to you. Remember, you'll be given in your final test an IMHAD report which has been adapted to fit about 3 standard pages. In these 3 pages and across the IMHAD sections, we're going to ask you questions about what study design is, what information we have regarding the participants, etc. When you identify the measures, think in terms of what the experimenters or the researchers more generally used in order to convey their study, in order to conduct it rather than convey, in order to conduct their study. So the instruments are to be differentiated from the material. Material is, as you know, all of the components which were used to elicit stimulus in the participants in order to test their reactions, to observe their reactions. However, in the instrument part, and if you do have a question about instruments, think in terms of what psychologists needed by way of tools in order to conduct their study. The measures here were a structured clinical interview for the DSM-4 Axis 1 disorders, the Beck Depression Inventory, and the Pemberton Happiness Index. Now, in the test, we'll ask you not to give so much detailed information about whether it was an 11-item index or a 21-item inventory. That's not, I mean, it is relevant, but it's not something we'll ask you about in the test because we haven't got enough time for that. However, we do want to see the name, the title of the instrument, the authors. So here between parentheses, you have For example, for the second one, Beck, Steer, and Brown, and the year of publication. So make sure you have these 3 pieces of information when we ask you in the final test what measures were used. Can you give its title, the names of the authors, and the year of publication? So these 3 pieces of information are what we'll be looking for. And then the procedure here can be inferred from the information gathered in that section. Um, what happened is that women were randomly allocated to different groups and then had to follow for a period of 10 weeks, PPI program on the one hand and a CBT program on the other hand. Remember, the procedure is what happens to the participants from the first stimulus to the last, all the steps that the participants had to go through for the researchers to carry out their study. In the results section, what type of question you'll have is typically a graph or table commentary. Just like you've been practicing for the oral comprehension exercise, we'll ask you to fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks in a structure type of template for a graph commentary. So it helps to have revised the structure, to do the kind of vocabulary that is required, and then you'll be required to pick and choose the relevant data from the graphs. In the answer key, for the first 2 graphs here, the first the line charts or run charts, the data that was indicated were estimates. So some numbers were provided, just 32 something, yes. These were all estimates so as to give you an example of what your commentary would look like. But of course, on the day of the test, you will have very precise data that you won't have to make up. As we proceed, note that this structure, that make sure you're familiar with it and it doesn't distress you in any way. The as adjective, as structure. So if you want to say something is on par, something is similar, there isn't much difference, you'll say it's as effective, powerful, impactful as something else. PPI here is as effective as CBT. And just to remind you, if you want to say that PPI is more efficient, you'll say it's more something than. The same structure applies if you're looking to express the contrary, that it's less efficient, less effective than. And note this information we find in the second graph there. The pie charts are entitled "Improvements are clinically significant." Clinically significant is an interesting phrase. It has to be differentiated from the phrase statistically significant. Now, to assert scientific validity to their findings, researchers need to capitalize on statistical significance. How likely is this phenomenon to reproduce itself? How likely is it to be reproduced? When it says it's clinically significant, it means look at the numbers. They speak by themselves. You can see that there's been a great improvement in the state of mind of these. So we had the Pemberton happiness. Let me check again. What was it? Pemberton Happiness Index and the Beck Depression Inventory, which are the main 2 bases of these graphs. The structured clinical interview was used for the diagnosis. So yes, clinically significant does show something to report, but what researchers really want to, when they want to confirm a solid hypothesis, they really need statistical significance. The fact that they insist on that aspect rather than statistics suggests that they did not find statistical significance. which doesn't mean that the study was useless. It's just a nice exploratory study to have. It's data which is worth having, and we can certainly draw some conclusions to an extent. Talking about conclusions, the discussion sections here in this poster, this section was called conclusions. In the IMRAD structure, you'll come across the word discussion. It's a question of style, and the majority of research writers will use discussion, but it's okay to use conclusions as well. In the discussion, we've seen that you expect to find a summary of the findings, and that's why in the first few weeks we had in class, I insisted on the fact that you should, even when discovering a brand new study, you should turn to the discussion fairly early on to clarify what the hypotheses were and whether they were confirmed or disconfirmed. Now, because this is a synthesized document, we find that each sentence refers to a particular hypothesis which was made. The first statement, improvements in both groups were comparable, is really finding number one. Finding number two is PPI was as effective as an established CBT for people with severe depression. Now, finding number three is PPI can be a promising therapeutic option for the treatment of clinical depression. Now, a little bit like in the introduction, you'll find that the bricks of the wall are being laid down so that we have a solid build-up to the final points in the conclusions regarding the findings of the study. The first section here will summarize the key points, the main findings. And what goes on in this particular paragraph is a reference to how these findings can apply to psychologists' practice, to everyday life situations. These findings contribute to increasing the range of therapeutic techniques offered to patients. So in practical terms, what does this research contribute? And the next sentence is typically something you find in discussions, is an implication for research. So applications of research and implications for research are very close. You can find out more about this in the textbook. And here we can see that it's in practical terms, this time for researchers in the scholarly world of science. How is this study instrumental in proving a phenomenon, improving the existence of a relationship? So future research should delineate how to combine the most effective components of both treatments. And what is missing here and that would appear in a typical discussion is a reference to alternative interpretations. That would be introduced by linking words such as however, or yet, pourtant, furthermore, de plus. The idea being that after the findings have been presented, they give us some external, sort of extra information that is going to help us go further, so that we have the overall picture and we can take a step back and think in terms of what variables may have played a role. This is where they may mention confounding variables. So remember, a confounding variable is une variable parasite. Any interaction that is worth mentioning will be mentioned there. And another aspect that is missing from this paragraph is how these findings, finding number 1, 2, and 3, how do they relate to the literature review presented in the introduction? And often you'll notice that the discussion sections contain references in between parentheses to other studies. And this is where they say typically this is consistent with, um, this is in keeping with what previous research has shown. Now, and these 2 points are typically articulated alternative interpretations after the main findings, and the conclusions for the literature review are typically to be found before the applications and implications. Um, so that's just for your information, and it's when you go back to your the reports that we use in class, it'll be useful to think strategically in terms of, I know that they need to have placed that kind of information. Where is it in the text? What kind of vocabulary can give it away as well, such as these linking words? Before I turn to what you should do in preparation for your final exam, I just want to highlight how findings 1, 2, and 3 gave away the hypotheses you had a question about. So if you recall, your questions regarding the poster had to do with what's the aim of the study and what are the operational hypotheses. So in the first place, before you can find the operational hypothesis, you need to have clarified what hypotheses were made. Remember, so if I go back to the original document from last week, what we'll see is not this. You had the information that first it was expected that both CBT and PPI would significantly lower depressive symptoms. And to make this hypothesis operational, we refer to the BDI scores. So concretely, what do we mean by CBT and PPI would have an impact on depressive symptoms? Remember, the operational hypotheses have to do with this. Furthermore, it was predicted that depressed patients' well-being would increase with a positive psychology intervention more than with CBT. And accordingly, it was also assumed that PPI would have an effect on severely depressed patients. So to answer my initial question, which was, where did I get the information from that I gave you in the answer key? Well, these answers were inferred from a mix of the end of the introduction we looked at in the poster, the information that it chose to display in the graphs, and finally, the findings which are presented in the discussion. Coming back here. So what does this mean for your final test? You should go back to these texts that we looked at in class. So the first 2 we did look at in class, and week 8 activity is something you had to work on your own. I saw some of your work, and most of you did really well. So that's great. Go back to these texts. See if you can draw your own list of linking words, which would be helpful. So the ones that I highlighted in orange. In order to build up your sort of acuity in reading, I'd like you to draw lists of the hyphenated qualifiers that you find. So these adjective forms which are created with hyphens. So a 6-month follow-up study, a follow-up study that lasted 6 months. When you start picking them up, it will help you sort of undo the complexity of dense sentences, and it'll make you, it'll force you to manipulate the language. So that's my my hope. And finally, look at the different uses of the past tense and the present tense. Something I didn't comment on before, but it's never too late, is the use in the method section of the present perfect here and the past tense here. Now, again, in the textbook, you can find some lessons about the difference between the present perfect and the preterite. But so far, let's just say, at this point, let's just say that you can note how the present perfect is structured around the auxiliary have and is followed by the past participle of the verb. Now, that can be tricky because for French speakers, the structure auxiliary have, avoir, followed by participe passé, is at the tense of the passé composé. But listen, the tense here is called present perfect. So as the name indicates in English, it's a tense of the present. And indeed, what this sentence says is that at this stage, on the day of writing, 34 women have been assessed. We only have the results of 34 women, but the follow-up study is still being conducted. So we're not placing a final point on our timeline. We're just saying here we had to extract information from this moment in time, and 34 women had been assessed. But it suggests the story the study carries on, and there'll be more numbers to come. On the contrary, when you look at the next line, participants were assigned to one of two manualized protocols. You have a typical example of the past tense or preterite. The past tense refers to a past action on which is not being commented on anymore, which is no longer which is no longer happening, and we are interested in the event as being finite, final, and over with. This is what happened in time -1. Participants were assigned to different groups. So yes, as you read through your texts again in a more critical manner in terms of what will I be evaluated on, what have I learned in this module, look up the past and present tenses in these texts. So they're clickable links here, and you'll find these studies that we discussed in class. The next thing you should do is to check the answer keys for these activities and make sure that you agree with them. Or if you don't, that's fine. Try to think critically about where did the teacher get the information from in the text, and see if you wouldn't have another interpretation and how you would answer it. If you have a question, please come and ask it on the frequently asked question forum, and I'll pick it up and I'll happily look at it with you. But it's best to do it on the FAQ on Moodle for the TD activities, because that way people can see what questions have already been asked, and every person coming in can contribute something new. Finally, we intend to post a mock exam for your final test. So just like in the oral comprehension exercise with the MCQ, we'll show you a format of an exam which will typically take place early in June. And then you'll be able to see what kinds of questions, how much time you have. At this stage, what I can tell you is that you will have to fill in blanks, select the correct words, and your comprehension of the text will be evaluated through an MCQ as well on the content of the text. So in terms of same as usual, what are the variables, what's the objective of the study, what are the variables, how were they operationalized for independent variables, or how were they measured for dependent variables, what's the method of data collection, what's the study design, what are the operational hypotheses, and what were the main findings. In the results section, we'll guide you through the writing up of a figure commentary where you'll have to fill in the blanks. And that's it for today. Do ask your questions on the FAQ on Moodle, and we'll be in touch.